Good morning, one and all. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, the commentary arm of Bloomberg News, and I'm joined today by two of my esteemed and very smart colleagues to discuss whether national security, diplomacy, and the global order with a U.S. newly discombobulated and unpredictable around trade, diplomacy, and national security. I can't think of two better people to sit with me today than Hal Brands and Andreas Kluth. They are both columnists for Bloomberg Opinion, and they both focus on national security and diplomacy. Hal is a professor at Johns Hopkins University. He's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he is the author of a new book that we will discuss during our chat today, The Eurasian Century. Andreas has a long and esteemed history covering diplomacy and international affairs from both Europe and the US. So let's get going. We've got a lot to talk about here. The three of us were joking before we went live that this is sort of the everything discussion because there are so many continents and issues in play right now. Hal, let's start. Let's talk about a thing that you addressed recently in one of your columns, this renewed and yet utterly old-fashioned idea of spheres of influence and what that might say both about Donald Trump's own worldview, the reordering of the post-World War II diplomatic model, and where we might go from here.
People have said that Trump has a 19th century view of international politics for a long time, and I think we've seen that come through ever so clearly in the first 3 months of his second term. For 80 years after World War II, give or take, the U.S. pursued something called the liberal international order, the rules-based international order, whatever you want to call it. But one of the key principles was that states should mostly have freedom of choice in their geopolitical alignments. Big states shouldn't be allowed just to steamroll small states and steal their territory and so on and so forth. And in some ways, Trump seems to be reverting to a much earlier mode of statecraft. He seems very comfortable with the idea that great powers, whether it's the US or Russia or maybe China, make the decisions in their own neighborhoods, and smaller countries have to live with that. And he's perfectly at home with the idea of territorial expansion, the idea that small states can have their territory coercively taken from them by larger states, which is what Trump has threatened to do in a variety of cases, mostly in the Western Hemisphere. And so this isn't sort of unprecedented in the US experience. It just goes back about 150 years to the way the United States did business during the 19th century.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing, though? I mean, the reason we progressed out of that model of spheres of influence was because ultimately other countries didn't like to be contained in one larger country's sphere. Oftentimes, over time, spheres led to confrontations about whether or not a sphere should be larger or smaller, and of course, a long series of very brutal wars. So in your mind, is it a healthy development that we are reliving the past right now in terms of diplomatic and national security ideas?
No, and I think that we have to any objective analysis would lead you to the conclusion that the post 1945 order has been more stable, more peaceful, at least through the avoidance of sort of great power war, and more humane, really, than any previous period in world history. And the other problem is that if you embrace the norm of spheres of influence and territorial expansion, then it's not clear what principled basis the United States has to object when Russia invades Ukraine or China coerces Taiwan or the Philippines. And the reason that US policymakers embraced these norms of the post-1945 order is that they had seen where a world without such protections led during the first half of the 20th century. And that was a very dark and ugly place.
Andreas, the fate of Pete Hegseth has been in the news quite a bit lately, whether or not he's going to remain as defense secretary. The broader context for that has been a series of revelations in the media about group chats over Signal from the leading policymakers around national security and diplomacy in the White House, having a number of uninvited guests, or rather invited guests who should not have been on those chats. In the first case, a journalist from The Atlantic's editor, Jeff Goldberg. More recently, it was reported that Hegseth's wife and other relatives were on a recent Signal chat discussing high-level U.S. military operations. Regardless of whether Hegseth is going to stay around or not, it is a sort of proxy for how shambolic and unpredictable U.S. management of foreign affairs and national security issues have been in these short few months since Trump was inaugurated. You're well, I like to think of you as both German and American, in the best sense of both regions. But as something of both an outsider and an insider looking in at the U.S. right now in this moment, how does it land for you, Andreas?
It lands for me, outsider, insider. It is right now, this particular week in the Hegseth saga, we have two aspects of Trumpism. One is chaos, and we've written lots of columns about he spreads his chaos deliberately, domestically, but also internationally, and the chaos now extends to inside the Pentagon. In fact, that's the word that's been used by various people who've departed just in recent days from his Pentagon and have said this is chaos. He must go for all the reasons you mentioned and many, many other things. So chaos is what Trump has sowed and is reaping. And against that, spite. I mean, everyone inside the Pentagon now, even the first Republicans in Congress, someone like Don Bacon, are saying this person has to go. But of course, Trump himself doesn't want to admit that, because that would remind people of his first administration, that he can make mistakes, or no, he's going to spitefully resist that for the time being until it's impossible. And in a way, this is sort of the pattern that goes back to the nominations, when we covered all of these nominations for cabinet members of blatantly incompetent people, incompetent and worse. But I won't even get into with scandals and conspiracy theories. You had people like Kash Patel, Tulsi Gabbard. We've described, we've opined on all these people. And Hegseth was from the beginning there questioned. No one ever suggested he's competent. He is qualified to lead the largest bureaucracy, the Pentagon, in the U.S. government. And now that's just becoming clear. So there's these two outrageous transgressions, the Signal chats you described. There's many others. He wanted to brief Elon Musk in his office on China policy. And then when that became clear, I think the White House canceled it. It's just one after another. And as it were, his own staff is leaving, is complaining. He is trying to blame it on others. They're shouting at each other in his office, that sort of thing. And
but Andreas, let's spin that out beyond Hegseth. Let's just talk about how does Europe and other leading powers see this right now, when there's unpredictability, when there is very public mistakes being made. How does this land with them in terms of their prior perceptions of the U.S. and U.S. policymaking and what they see going on now?
Well, let's call it old Europe, so not new Europe, Hungary, Orban, who is the model for much of this Trumpism, but old Europe, what Rumsfeld called old Europe, the European Union. The Germans, for example, are used to the world. Hal described the world for 80 years where, as I've once, compared it or made a metaphor, where the US was the father figure and France was the mother figure for Germany, for example, after World War II, literally rebuilt it, literally gave the Germans a democratic constitution after the war, and then protected them with nukes, with troops stationed there. And the US was reliable, was a stabilizer, a deterrent toward the Kremlin. All of that is gone, but it was already gone in the first Trump term. But then there was an interim. It wasn't clear which way is America going to go. And it is now clear that America is going to go the worst possible way, but even faster, even worse than they had feared. So in Europe, Europe had many decades become what Macron and what the French like to call strategic autonomy or something like that, and they never did it. There is no European army, and there probably won't be. But they've realized that America under Trump, or someone like Trump, someone like Vance, will not be there for them, and they've got to do something. Unfortunately, they have their own long-standing problems because they don't see the world the same way in the European Union, and they probably won't get together. But they are horrified, and I would say it's an existential crisis. If you just look at the recent German election, what they talked about on both sides, and how a transatlanticist like Friedrich Merz, the incoming chancellor, even he said basically the Americans are gone. The world as we knew it, we assumed that America would protect us, and then we could do other things, including economic sins like a form of mercantilism. But that is all gone, and we have to rethink. I'm highly doubtful that they'll successfully rethink it and do something about it. But that is an existential shock to the Europeans, and in a similar way, I think, to South Koreans and Japanese and others who have to think about things like, should we have our own nukes?
Which is, we'll get to that in a little bit later. I mean, you have both Poland and Taiwan talking about ramping up their own independent military power so they can fill a gap that they fear the U.S. is leaving behind them. Hal, I want to read something to you from one of your recent columns. You wrote, many of Trump's gut instincts, his ambivalence about U.S. alliances, his yearning for good relations with Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping, are well suited to spheres of influence diplomacy. He doesn't seem averse to striking great power bargains at the expense of weaker states. We just touched on this a little bit a moment ago, but I want to look more deeply into this issue of how central Trump's own decision-making and unpredictability are to trying to figure out where we are right now. You've watched all of this for a very, very long time. And have you ever encountered a diplomatic and national security architecture built atop the preferences of one person in a way that we're seeing right now during Trump's second administration?
I think Trump personalizes foreign policy, and he personalizes international relations more heavily than any American president since Franklin Roosevelt, and perhaps in history. And the reason actually that we have the national security apparatus that we have right now, a National Security Council and things like that, is that people saw Roosevelt conduct foreign policy in this very personalized manner with special envoys for everything, giving conflicting instructions and so on and so forth. And they said, well, let's not try this at home. And so let's create a more structured system that will give the president the support that he or she needs to manage a global foreign policy. Trump has no time for that. And he's basically said, I don't need all these meetings because I'm the only one who matters in the end. And then you layer on top of that his willingness to make relations with key states dependent on his personal relationship with the leader of those states. And so a lot of the trouble in U.S.-German relations during the first term came back to the fact that Trump and Angela Merkel just did not like each other and did not get along. That's a lot of what's going on in the U.S.-Canada relationship, or at least what was going on when Trump seemed to delight in tormenting Justin Trudeau. And so this is the challenge this creates, is that it makes U.S. policy ever less predictable, as Andreas mentioned, because where the U.S. ends up on a key issue may hinge on how good or how bad Trump's last interaction with a foreign leader was. And I'll give you just one example of this, which is coming to a head right now. The Trump administration and Trump himself have to make a big decision in the next 2, 3, 4 weeks about what to do in Ukraine. The peace talks are not going where Trump wants them to go. He thought it was going to be easy to make peace. You threaten the Russian with sanctions, you put a little pressure on Ukraine, and everybody would come to the table. It turns out to be very hard. And so Trump has to decide whether he wants to go down a much more difficult path of pressuring Russia more significantly, or whether he just sort of wants to wash his hands of the situation and walk away. And I think that both Putin and Zelensky are betting on the fact that Trump's decision will come down to who he has the better personal relationship with. And so they're in a game right now where they're essentially trying to make sure that the other side is blamed for the breakdown in negotiations, betting on the fact that Trump will get mad at that person and it will tip things in their direction.
But Trump's already shown, at least in most of his public actions, that he seems to be tilting toward Russia around this particular encounter. And, famously, he and J.D. Vance took Zelensky into a very public woodshed at the White House around what they perceived as his lack of gratitude for U.S. support of Ukraine in the war against Russia. And Trump has made very public statements about his high regard in which he holds Putin. If you were a betting man, Hal, how would you see that playing out, given what's already transpired and what Trump has signaled thus far?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that Trump and Zelensky also just haven't gotten along for a number of years, really dating back to Trump's first term, when Trump blamed Zelensky in part for his first impeachment. Just to break it down a little bit further, I think there are three options that Trump has. Put more pressure on Russia, try to bribe Russia with concessions inside or outside of Ukraine, or wash your hands of the situation and walk away. Trump will sort of gesture in the direction of pressuring Russia, but he hasn't shown much interest in actually doing that, right? So he'll say there are going to be more sanctions, but the body language indicates the opposite. He will be tempted then to try to buy the Russians off with concessions inside or outside Ukraine. The one that's been floated is recognizing Russian sovereignty over Crimea. That would be a big deal, and in my view, that would be a mistake. But the challenge there is that the Ukrainians essentially get a veto on that, and they can say, well, you can recognize it, but we never will, and so it's not actually part of any peace deal. And so what I think that will push Trump towards eventually is basically saying, I thought this was going to be easy. It's hard. I don't want anything to do with it. And then I think the critical question is, does I don't want anything to do with it mean Trump is disengaging, but the rest of the U.S. government, particularly the intelligence community that's been supporting Ukraine, stays engaged? In which case, I think Ukraine can hang on for a while. Or does it mean the U.S. is done with this? In which case, it's a considerably bigger lift for Ukraine to stay in the fight.
Andreas, this obviously, however this gets resolved, is going to be of great concern to all of Europe, Western Europe and Eastern Europe. How do you think the Europeans are going to position themselves going forward, given all of this uncertainty about Ukraine's fate?
The Europeans are caught. It's interesting. If you had to point a finger at a potential leader right now, it's Emmanuel Macron, who early after in the full-scale invasion wasn't really in that position. Giorgia Meloni is the closest to Trump in the way that Hal described. That may matter. The Europeans are trying to position themselves so that they have an alternative answer, which they don't. They don't have the raw power. There's long since Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State, been talk or controversy, I should say, about a European pillar within NATO. The Americans used to discourage that, but then they talked about, would that be a good thing, a bad thing? But the question for the Europeans is, once it becomes clear that Trump and therefore America going forward, because they want to pivot to Asia or wherever, will not come to the old world's defense there, then they have to put something in its place or enter a form of serfdom. They're used to being a regulatory superpower. There's something called the Brussels effect. If you want to, make sneaker like a light bulb or something, you have to pay attention. If you want to sell to European market, you observe that. They're an economic and a trade superpower, because trade is the one area where they have unified, where they can actually counter U.S. power. But in all the other respects that matter, including the monetary union, but specifically military and political power, They just have not taken that step. And in fact, France has always been one of the countries preventing that when it came to a European army, for example. So they talk the talk, but they've never walked the walk. And from a former German.
And the clock is running now. So
Yeah.
the
My
leisure
favorite
that they once enjoyed about not talking and walking is, the clock is not ticking.
My favorite quote about the Europeans is from a former German foreign minister. They're herbivores in a world of carnivores. I mean, and this is now the carnivores. Trump is a carnivore, wants to pose as a carnivore with Xi and Putin and the others. And if you've grown up as a herbivore and all you've ever eaten is grass, and you rely on the rules-based international order to do your trade, and everyone plays nicely in Brussels and in Strasbourg, then you don't have an answer for this. And at the moment, they do not have an answer. And that is why I'm very pessimistic about Europe.
Well, so in speaking of carnivores, you have this in one of your recent columns. In coming to grips with the second term of President Donald Trump, many of us made the mistake of hoping that he was just trash talking the world, like a boxer needling his opponents in the ring, that he didn't really mean the outrageous things he said. And just as pessimists feared, the journey is heading toward isolationism, imperialism, caprice, and entropy. This is similar, I think, or it's a variation on what I just talked to Hal about how deeply personal and individualized this moment is, because so much of it revolves around Trump's instincts and predilections. I guess I have to say, I have been struck around issues like trade and national security and even domestic policy issues in the U.S. that people being surprised by Trump surprises me, simply because I think there's been shades of this his whole life. He pushed in many of these directions during his first term. And then, of course, during his campaign, he campaigned heavily on tariffs, and he campaigned heavily on the idea that the U.S. was overextended in Ukraine and that it was going to take China to the woodshed. So is the fact that people are surprised by Trump 2.0 a reflection of us more than it's a reflection of Trump himself?
That me or Hal?
Go ahead, Andreas.
Unfortunately, I think it is to some extent a reflection of us, including the three of us, certainly including me, mea culpa. We tend to be intellectuals, and we want to be fair. So we impose intellectual patterns, order on things that are where there is chaos. In fact, John Bolton, and you, because you've written books about Trump long before we even studied or paid attention to him, but even people like John Bolton got it right when he said his thoughts are an archipelago of dots. They're unconnected. It is not necessarily coherent, but because we write coherent columns about foreign policy and we assume he has advisors, we want to say, no, there is an ism. There are isms: protectionism, isolationism, mercantilism, imperialism, whatever. And it is coherent. He has a plan. And then, of course, his fans say, oh, there's multidimensional chess going on and stuff. So there's a master plan. And I think that probably we went too far in that direction. The whim, the caprice of it, the fact that, as Hal said, that it's just whatever. If he talks to one person at breakfast and then another at lunch, and then he does whatever he heard at lunch, even if it's the opposite of what he heard at breakfast. We haven't quite got our mind around that, because nobody in America, certainly for the past 80 years, has ever made foreign policy quite like that.
Let's pivot away from Europe and toward Asia, Hal. And do you think the Chinese are surprised by this version of Trump? And let's discuss the U.S. and China in the same way we just discussed the U.S. and Europe in this moment we're in right now.
I think the Chinese have been of the mind that there were sort of two Trumps. There was the Trump who, in some ways, initiated this new Cold War during his first term and unveiled a lot of the measures, diplomatic and technological, that the Biden administration picked up on. There was also the Trump that was constantly on the lookout for some sort of grand bargain with Beijing and was acting as a wrecking ball on America's alliances. And China experienced both of those Trumps in Trump 1.0. And I don't think Beijing was entirely sure which Trump it was going to get this time around. I think there was concern that they might get sort of the more harder edged anti-China Trump, but also hope in the first couple of months in particular that you might get a deal on TikTok, that you might get a deal on trade, that Trump was simply layering on the first 20% of tariffs as a negotiating ploy. And so there was an effort in Beijing not to prejudice the relationship, not to hit back so hard that tipped the relationship into an escalatory cycle or sort of a tit for tat spiral. And that all changed on April 2nd, because the severity of the tariffs that Trump imposed and then the back and forth over the next week, I think convinced a lot of policymakers in Beijing that the United States is bent on containment and suppression, that Trump is bent on containment and suppression, and you're just not going to get to a better place in the relationship anytime soon. And so I think the leadership in Beijing now believes we're in much more of a full spectrum confrontation, and it could get pretty nasty in a variety of different locales.
Andreas, is the U.S. ready to sort of stick its head in the sand and pound people on tariff policy, but disengage militarily? Those things are somewhat at odds, and alienate allies alongside perceived opponents, particularly around trade.
Is the U.S. ready? No, I don't think it's ready. And you see the country is split, you know that, and the party is split within the Republic. I mean, the MAGA isolationists or the Vance wing is dominant right now, but many Republicans are uncomfortable with the direction. The trade war, America our 401ks are destroyed, people's retirements delayed by a decade. There is no sense in which at some point it is harder and harder to deny or to spin this alternate reality for MAGA fans that Trump is delivering the opposite of what he promised, which was peace through strength. Okay, he's making America in the world so much weaker, and domestically so much weaker in so many ways that'll become clearer and clearer. America's not ready for that. I think there's a lot of little things like he declares trade war on the world, in particular in China. China reminds him that all the dysprosium and neodymium that I've once written about, those are the rare earths that make magnets and Teslas and iPhones and everything here work. Oh, by the way, we have them and we won't give them to you. So this is going to be, America will wake up to the reality that it is part of the world, surprise. And that if it screws up, and that the reason why it became a hegemon after World War II is because it was the only one who could restore order and keep some semblance of order in the world. And if it now abdicates that responsibility, the world will go back to chaos, which Trump seems to want. Elon Musk likes chaos. They all like chaos. But then there'll be a reckoning and we'll wake up. And I would say America is not ready for what's coming, for what it is causing.
Hal, there's been a lot of discussion as markets have been in flux lately about uncertainty about whether or not U.S. Treasuries are a safe haven for investors. The dollar has lost some of its luster as the currency of last resort. And, I've sort of wondered whether long-term there'd be an economic outcome of that we would live with well beyond Trump. And I've been thinking about the same thing in the diplomatic sphere. Depending on how the chips fall over the next several months and the remainder of Trump's term over the next few years, do you have a view yet as to whether or not some of the chaos and disorder that we're seeing now is going to have a permanent and lasting impact, or is this something that Trump and the U.S. and other nations can sort of soldier through? And there'll be a place at the other end where some reparations can be made? Or is there going to be kind of permanent diplomatic and national security scarring from all of this?
So I'm with Andreas in the sense that I don't necessarily think that the future of U.S. foreign policy has been decided. I think there's going to be a big fight once Trump passes from the scene for leadership of the Republican Party and sort of the American direction of foreign policy more broadly. The problem is that you're not going to be able to unring the bell of what has happened in these last 4 years and then in Trump's first term. And so even if U.S. foreign policy goes in a more constructive direction, it's hard for me to imagine countries in Europe being willing to accept the level of dependence that they had on the United States for so long, because they'll always be worried that something like this will happen again, and that dependence will be weaponized. It's a little bit different in the Asia Pacific, because countries there have fewer options, even theoretically, for reducing their dependence on the United States. And to be clear, I think that U.S. allies everywhere are going to try to hang on to as much of the relationship with the U.S. as they can for as long as they can, because they know that in the near term, there's no good alternative. But I do think psychologically and diplomatically, this is going to leave a pretty deep imprint.
I wish that we could end on a happier note, but we've run out of time, and there's a lot to concern us on an ongoing basis in the world around us. So I'm sure both of you will come back and join us again to visit the same topic. Hal Brands, Andreas Kluth, they're both columnists for Bloomberg Opinion. I'm Tim O'Brien, the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, and we'll see you next week for our politics live stream. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.